Thank you. I have a question for the organizers. This morning, there was a poll. Is it possible to measure the quality of Baukultur? Is it possible to show the results of the poll on the screen, please? So the majority is yes, quality can be evaluated through value judgments and discourse. And yes, quality is quantifiable. And there are very, very few no's. Paul, I will go first. My first question will be for you. I know that you loved Colin's book. Now, I'm sure you're pleased to sit next to him. That's the one thing.
Rush to Amazon.
Yep. Paul is head of the digital studio of Arup, the well-known firm. And he, when we discussed this panel, we had a short discussion also about do the right things or do the things right. Paul, can you develop a little bit, knowing that we are in a session about measuring?
I sure can. So for those not familiar with Arup, we are a firm that has been known to build complex, hard infrastructure, much like the space that we're in today. Projects like the Pompidou Center, Sydney Opera House. But like probably a lot of organizations in this room, Arup has had to evolve over the last few years to compete. So that is essentially, on one side, understanding technology and how it's changing to do those jobs, probably understanding policy because we're involved with cities and spaces to understand you can have good ideas and you know how to get things done, but then if you don't have the mechanisms of of the government working in your favor, you don't do things. And then I think the most interesting thing, which has led to me building out my department across the world, is the clients pushing us over the last few years to not just say, we want you to build the thing right, like this beautiful structure, but before you take resources out of the earth and waste time don't solve problems that people don't have. So we're actually seeing this a lot in requests for proposals where public and private sector clients, they'll say, well, what's it going to feel like? And for Arup, that was really hard for a number of years when you're civic engineers or MEP engineers or material scientists. And so that's kind of this, it's grown this capability of experience design in order to measure that. So I think you can do that from a number of different ways. But the way in which you're doing it is, I come from more of a technology design approach. And it's saying, how can we understand these problems earlier, prototype them and test them quickly to get some sort of measurable evidence that it's solving the right problem, and it might be satisfaction scores or an impact on a local community, before you build more stuff.
Yeah. But does that mean that your clients are asking for this?
The clients have 100% pulled us in here, in that direction. It is not the firm. It is when you lose enough projects because you can't explain how it feels, they start listening to new approaches. And I think that's it, because you want demonstrable evidence. Oftentimes, a lot of the projects, if they're civic projects, you have public referendums, you have local populations that they will contest you with their vote, or they'll block you, or now more and more they're taking to the streets. So you need empirical evidence to make a case for your concept in order to move it forward. And then, so I think there's, I look around at all the great architects in this room, and luckily we work in this space where we're working with visionary architects and academia and organizations, but so many things have to happen right to build anything. It's pretty amazing, where you have to have a great idea and a great integrated team, be a little lucky, and then make all those kind of cases, those data points to be able to realize something.
Thank you. By the way, Slido is still working, and you can send questions that we will see on the screen. Do not hesitate to do so. Also, for the questions that were not answered this morning, Don't worry about them. They will be still very, very useful for the records and the future of this whole exercise. So please start asking questions. I have a question for Georg Pendl, who is the president of the Architects Council of Europe. Is there a, let's say, a difference? Is it the same to speak about quality of Baukultur for a city, a neighborhood, or an interior place? I'm asking you the question because at the meeting in Brussels not long ago, you said that it should be forbidden to build rooms that were lower than 3 meters. So how do you see, is it the same to speak in Baukultur for different types of environments? Because this afternoon we will have a session on streetscapes and on workplaces. So how do you see that?
I think it's the same.
And can you measure?
And
can you measure it?
It's the same because it's a question of what in German we call Haltung. I don't know a real English translation for it. It's kind of approach, attitude, how to work, how to solve problems. That's the thing, and this is always the same if you are designing a table or if you are designing a city. In my view, it doesn't change.
It doesn't change. Are we? Because the question in the program was mainly based on value assessments. But
That was the second question.
do you think that we should look at value assessments, or do we need to look at more objective assessments? And I will ask the questions to the 3 of you. Maybe Colin, you start.
Sure, yeah. I think that both are important. I think, and we certainly use both in our work. I think that there are lots of questions that are so subtle to get at the answers to in any other way than by interrogating the participants, and that can mean anything from using a simple, it's still quantitative, but using a scale that asks them to reflect on their own experiences, to even something like just a structured interview. At the same time, one of the things that we've seen sometimes in our work is that people will say one thing to us and that their bodies will tell us something else. So I could tell some long stories about this, but I won't. I'll just say that in some cases I've asked, for example, people to report on their own levels of arousal, and where they've reported them as being low, I have measured them as being actually quite high. So I think, we don't always know the kinds of things that affect us, and we don't always know exactly how our bodies are responding to the settings that we're in. So I think it's nice to be able to have both kinds of measures.
I would completely agree. My background as someone who designs technology, I think is a little bit of a different approach, and there was a comment earlier about how architects are taught and the critique of a room like this in front of everybody. That was very different for designing technology because everyone was kind of figuring it out, and almost every 2 years you have to refigure it out again. So it's a little bit more of a process of, if you think about the tech bubbles that have imploded, you've had to, maybe be worried you weren't going to get funding or lose your job, so you'd have to come up with really lean ways to do it. And often those came back to very human-centered design, where you'd have to run out into the street and talk to 10 people to see if something worked, to then evolve that. So, but I think the empirical data is really interesting because it can point you to a situation, but it's not going to tell you why. There's a project that we're running in Manchester, and for 15 years they've been trying to put in kind of clean air regulations, and it's almost these decrees that come out to try to punish often laborers that need to drive across the city to go to a job site, and they'd get stiff resistance, and then the initiative would be shelved. But we started doing more just qualitative, inclusive workshops in which we tried to kind of understand how they worked. And one of the things that came out was we started seeing other data of just really high child asthma rates. And then when you started explaining it to say, would you be willing to change your behaviors if your kids could breathe when they played, you had a lot of really tough kind of construction workers kind of now leaning in and saying, tell me more about that, as opposed to just immediately being against it. So I think you need that kind of, you need the big data to kind of point you in the direction, but then you need the softer qualitative techniques, and that might be just I think early on in the project, going out, interviewing people, shadowing them, showing that you're just attempting to listen before you come up with a solution, that's the only way that I see now. And I think it's because this generation, we're used to participating, we're used to having our voices heard. I'm going to Instagram this, I'm going to rate this, as a comment was earlier. And if people feel like they're not included, they're going to use everything they can and do everything they can to kind of slow down your initiative, even if it's something like improving air quality, which is great for everybody.
Georg?
What was the question?
I'm actually changing the question
Yeah.
because I see questions on the screen that scientists know so little about architecture. Yes, but why do architects know so little about neuroscience?
Because we don't listen so often to so interesting lectures like he has. I liked really very much your sentence about having a heart attack because of walking through a boring city. That's great. No, I still wanted to say one sentence about the value assessment, because I think this is a core cultural question at the end, because it has to do with the conventions a society has achieved, and it's moving, it's changing. If you think about 500 years ago, if you think about other places, it's nothing objective, and so it cannot be reflected in numbers anyway. So this makes it very clear. It's a thing where we share common values, and we have to discuss the common values, and we also have to discuss if things which we are doing are in line with these common values. So it's a question of discussion, of debate, and it's a permanent question.
That came very strongly out of the discussion of this morning, I thought. But Colin, why do you think that architects do not know or know so little about neuroscience?
Well, when I first saw that question, I thought it was a commentary on my talk. The scientists knowing so little about architecture. I think that I'm in an organization which is mostly North American, but we're striving to be more global, called the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. And it's at the moment it's about, I would say, probably 80% architects and 20% neuroscientists, and it's been more of a struggle to capture the attention and interest of neuroscientists in the kinds of questions that we're discussing here. I don't know why. It just, I'm a little biased, but it staggers me as to how anybody could not be fundamentally fascinated by this stuff. As far as the yeah, I know I'm biased. As far as the other side of the equation, there have been lots of discussions of. Again, the ones that I'm privy to have been mostly in the US, of including more neuroscience content in the architectural curriculum. And the answer generally has been, we would love to do this, but how? It's already so jam-packed, filled with things. How do we add more onto this? So there are, this is going a bit beyond an answer to your question, but there are now in various places throughout the world. There's a program in Venice, there's another one in San Diego, which is essentially a short course for architects who would like to know more about neuroscience. And those are doing really well. They're oversubscribed. So I think there is some appetite.
But should that be part of the general curriculum of architects and landscape designers, interior designers, urban planners? I remember that at my university we had a course on environmental psychology, but at the time the professor warned us not to attach too much importance to architectural determinism. But actually, you're coming now with the proof that a couple of things are correct. So what do we do from here?
I'm not sure how far I want to wade into this. Yeah. It's tricky territory. I mean, I honestly do think, I noticed one of the other questions here is about beauty and whether it's universal or cultural. And I honestly do think that there is, throughout all of aesthetics, including architecture, there is kind of a backbone of things that work well for essentially everybody. But again, overlaid on all of that are cultural references that might vary quite a bit. So I think maybe one of the reasons why when we don't agree on some of this stuff, the source of the disagreement might be the relative weighting of the one as opposed to the other. I'm not sure, but I've had lots of, well, not lots, I've had some quite fractious interactions with architects who have claimed that the the part of the story that I'm describing as being universal, a universal aesthetic, is not really very important in terms of what makes a great building.
Mm-hmm. I would also like to say to the room that maybe some people are not so tech savvy for using Slido. Be aware that we can also give you the mic, so you just wave and there can be other questions. There was a question about the question about beauty, and I was happy that you picked that up. Georg, can you say something more about beauty and about measurement? And is it desirable that we measure beauty?
No, not in figures. That's very clear. It's not a thing for numbers. And of course, our societies have a tendency to, we want to measure everything. We want to have clear facts. We want to have just numbers. In economies, in sociology, wherever we count numbers. And of course this is, so this also kind of swallows cultural fields where it really hasn't lost anything to do, to make clear. It makes things rather unclear. In my view, of course you can, actually I like the term beauty because the term beauty was a bit out of fashion for a certain time, and actually nowadays it comes more and more back that we are so honest to say things have, that we are so honest to say that things have to be beautiful, simply. It's very simple. And I would say I wouldn't like to measure beauty, as I wouldn't like to measure love. How do you measure love? With the time you spend together, with the amount of kisses you exchange each other, or some other thing. It's crazy, and it makes it obvious that it doesn't work. And the same is with the beauty. But I would say you can assess in a way beauty, but this you cannot do only by yourself, in my view, about buildings. It has to be a process of discussion. As for and it has to do with experience, it has to do with knowledge, it does not have to do with academic education. I'm sorry, every layman can achieve the knowledge to assess beauty for himself, and the result can be the discussion of a group, like we have it in juries in the architectural field. It's quite a common and quite a positive way to find out a good project among many others.
Paul, is quality something that is static, or does it evolve over time? And then if you were working for Arup, what do you do if you design something that is of high quality? And how can you anticipate how it will evolve over time, or whether it will be static?
So I'm interested. It's interesting, I'm sitting between an architect and a neuroscientist, and I'm not either, but yet I'm on the same panel answering these questions. I think we're beyond static anything at this point, and I think that's where the built environment is trying to figure itself out, where even the way we budget and scope these projects, there's a move-in, here are the keys, see you later, and we don't learn from them. And there's a lot of data that comes out of either kind of BIM models when people are designing or modeling, to sensors that are in all of these spaces that no one tries to learn from, and it's really, or even pull it into the next project. So I think that's something in which kind of this idea around flexible spaces or like living buildings is really interesting. You're seeing it more, I mean, an event like this is great because it's a pop-up space that could be a conference one day and a school the next day, and not just sit empty and idle like half the office buildings do when we leave and go home at 6 o'clock at night. So I think we're getting into more, as more and more people are coming into our cities, we need to kind of rethink what physical spaces mean so they're not static. Maybe rethink kind of our, we're seeing it in the UK, in London specifically, a new office we're building basically is half the desks of our current staff. And we're not eliminating workforce, but we're encouraging people to work from home and work remotely because we just can't kind of deal with the cost of a desk. So I think architecture has a lot of opportunity there. There just seems to be a lot of gaps when you think about going through a project. There, developers that own the land versus someone that's doing the base build versus, there's just a lot of gaps between handing off information between those parties. And there really isn't, unlike technology that's always changing, and even cities that are always changing, oftentimes I feel like the physical spaces seem to be the ones that that remain the same. And some countries move quicker. We're talking a little bit about Chinese clients this a little bit earlier. And even the idea of quality is saying, are they trying to build something that lasts 50 years or 5 years to just deal with the next 5 years? So almost you see certain, specifically East Asian countries, quality is measured in a very different way, and it's about housing people quickly, not getting something to last another 50 years, or just moving a new city up the river.
You spoke about housing people. You mentioned 50 years. What about the sustainability? Who takes decisions about sustainability? Because during the lunchtime, somebody said to me, but where are the developers? They think in shorter terms, and therefore maybe they have different quality, let's say, aspirations than a neuroscientist, somebody of an agency like Arup, or an architect. So how do you see that? You work with developers, don't you?
I think it's incredibly complex, because if you use, and luckily sustainable materials prices are coming down, but if you use them, that drives up the prices of a building, which means it's unaffordable for maybe a younger buyer to move into, or not even a younger buyer. I think London is, it always amazes me how many people they're successful directors of big companies and they have roommates. And so clearly something isn't working, but I think we have to figure out ways in which those material costs, we're making better choices with them. And often the technology in these materials are changing so quickly, we're quick to put them in place, and you realize that they're unsustainable. There's a huge issue in Ireland with a lot of the, almost all of the drywall that was used over the last 10 years of the build out is crumbling, because everyone thought it was a half the price and twice as strong, and it wasn't true because no one had really proven out the materials that they're using. So I think you need to push it. Maybe we're having a generation coming up with the environmental revolution and kind of a more conscious, where people are willing to pay more for sustainable goods and sustainable buildings. Even my flight here, I was interested in seeing the kind of there was a call out saying this flight uses 30% less emissions. And it was an interesting thing of like, okay, all right, I'll pay £50 more for that. So I think you're kind of, those details are being presented to us in a way, and that might drive kind of a different supply.
Mm-hmm. Does that mean that we will make our decisions in a different way if we get other information, Colin? Because you measure quite a lot of things.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, just to sort of follow up on what Paul was saying, I think that it will be driven by the client. I think as they make increasing demands for better quality structures, that will drive the process. I think they will only do that, or maybe not only, but they will be more likely to do that when they understand the stakes, when they understand what can be gained from high quality Baukultur, from more sustainable settings, and so on.
There is a question, it has just moved, but the idea was that shouldn't an event like this be more open to the public, in the sense that we are all experts in different area of expertise. The thing is then, how do you start? How do you start with here? Shouldn't this event be more open to the public and step out of elitary expert atmosphere?
Well,
Here, as president of the Architects' Council in Europe.
It's too late to ask this question.
No, but for the future, this is just the beginning.
Sure. No, of course, sure. And the point is that we very often discuss within a bubble. We are a bubble, and if we don't leave the bubble, it shall not help us and nor the others. For me, this is a fundamental thing, to go outside and try to talk to everybody who is involved. And I would say there is a lot of new developments in Europe and also in the world in architecture, where you have much more involvement of users, involvement, participation of public audience, etc., etc. This is a core issue for me. And yeah, so the answer is yes, it should.
Mm. Are there any questions in the room? Not for the moment.
Can I add to
Yeah,
that one as well?
please.
I'm a firm believer in kind of human-centered design. It starts with public engagement, and then you put ideas out. But I think when you do that, you have to set really clear expectations that you can't solve all of their problems. You have a very specific remit for a project, and you can learn from them. And generally, if people are just included, they seem to get behind it in a way. But we're seeing more and more of this. We ran a project, kind of an art installation project, in which we set up about these 25 kind of sensor, like survey feedback things. And essentially, we just got people's perceptions on different smart city technology. And it was really interesting when you brought this exhibition to different parts of London, where certain technology or certain changes, they would just change this wouldn't be really kind of scientifically accurate, but you just get kind of a gut feeling on people's fears, motivations, and challenges. And the other thing that they're doing is they're kind of engaging with a piece of art or technology, but that means they can't hold their cell phones, so they're looking up and they're talking to each other and they're talking to their neighbors. So it's different ways that you can have community engagement that kind of starts poking at things that that help not just the design process, but maybe how you market an initiative, how maybe local government starts to communicate it in a way, and that could change block by block or neighborhood by neighborhood when you start talking to people.
Mm-hmm. Colin, there is a question that is on the top of the screen for some time, and it's directly related to your talk. How could universal principles and cultural references become a conscious tool for taking high-quality design decisions? Do you have any advice to give?
That's a very hard question to answer for reasons that I tried to convey in my talk. I can explain the universal principles to my eye are fairly straightforward, but understanding how to combine those with cultural references to make a tool. I'm skeptical that you can, in the sense of having a kind of an A to B to C kind of formalism, a methodology for doing for making the right decisions. It's culture is hard in this field. Universal principles, tractable. Culture, I can measure after the fact, and I can tell you what's happened, but I can't go from that to making recommendations for what you should do before something exists.
Wait, that's quite interesting, because you say I can measure afterwards, and actually Paul is trying to anticipate before they build something.
Or just make a low quality version. So this actually brings up a project we're working on right now where, according to maybe civic design best practices, one of the best things a city can do for air quality is introduce bike lanes, bike schemes, public bike share. So we're part of a project that's starting to consider introducing it in Ankara, Turkey. The issue is no one rides bicycles in Turkey at all. So how do you start to seed this, get people, and I don't know, I might need everyone's help here, because we, be careful of the projects you win, but it might be a 5-10 year thing where you're starting to introduce this idea of like healthy lifestyles, or kind of maybe building more community hubs around these bike share stations, because that will help reduce vehicular traffic and encourage then reduce air quality issues, or improve air quality issues and improve healthier lifestyles. But that's one where we just have to make it, and we have to go out there and start talking to people. And that is a principle. Like, we know that's good for people and for cities, but culturally it isn't, it's never been done there.
Mm-hmm.
I love that idea, and that's a much better answer than the one that I just gave. Just trying stuff. Tactical urbanism, throwing things together at low cost, and then measuring and seeing what works. I mean, another way to go that we've tried with kind of mixed success is visualizations, using things like immersive VR. But I think throwing things together when you can for not great investment, just to see, just to open a wedge, to figure out what's important, what's not, is a great way to go.
Mm-hmm. I would say, and I'd love your perspective on this, that seems to be really hard for architects. I've noticed this over the last decade or so, working more and more with architects and planners, et cetera, where we're all designers, we all actually use the same terms and the same stages, but my approach is very lean, very scrappy, let's get some stuff out there. And architects really can't do that because if you don't get it past the line, you lose 4 months of work, your plans get rejected, there's public safety issues to deal with. So we have these two, again, we're designers, but we have very different ways of working. And so oftentimes I think on these integrated teams like the team I have, and you have urban planners, ethnographers, digital designers, architects, you kind of see everyone, you have to go through this awkwardness of a project, or if you're on a partner team, of just realizing wait, what do you mean by prototype, and what do you mean by let's map your REBA stages to your AIA stages or something like that, because it's very different. And so oftentimes maybe architects have viewed my work and my team's work as kind of slackers, oh, they'll do it later, or because we kind of we could just ship some code and it's changed, and we might look at be like, oh, he's so stiff, and but I think that's interesting because these are two complex problems that involve many different disciplines. So we're all going to be spending a lot more time together, and we have to figure out how each other work. And maybe I kind of always use the analogy of a band in a way, where everyone's going to have their solo moment and kind of come up and drum solo, bass solo, guitar solo, but just show how everyone can kind of fit in together on these mixed teams.
Mm-hmm. You spoke about weird. This morning we heard about whoop. And there was a question about the main obstacle for Baukultur. Now, what's the main obstacle for measuring? Colin.
I'm blanking. My main obstacle is money.
It's
money. It's
money.
It's really expensive to do this work well.
Which was something that Paul was saying with different words just before. You said money and time.
I would say I think research is often a dirty word in design. When I've had bosses that I've worked for, when you say we're going to need to do 2 weeks of user research and then 2 weeks of design. Oh, we can't do research because they associate it with kind of really rigorous, expensive funding budgets. And then if I would just come back and say, I just need to do 4 weeks of design, I'd get it approved. I would do the research and then at the end say, voila, and there was this kind of teachable moment. But I think research scares a lot of clients when you say it sometimes. So I'm not. You need to do what you have to do to get, this is again, a scrappy answer. You need to tell people what they need to hear sometimes in order to get by. I mean, everyone here works with clients, so you can probably relate. But yeah, I don't know if the neuroscientists would agree with that.
No, I resonate to that completely. When I was just getting into this field, I went to visit a company that was in the business of building amusement parks, entertainment complexes, and so we were scoping out the possibility of me collaborating with them. And they said, they gave me the skeleton of a thing that they were working on. They said, what would you do? And I said, well, I would set up this experiment and design this and have these variables and test 100 people or whatever. And they just shook their heads and they said, you don't understand our process. This is, when we have a tender, we've got, it's 24 hours a day. We've got maybe a couple of weeks to put together a proposal. We don't have the time to wait for your research. So that's a big obstacle.
Mm-hmm. Georg, do you want to add something? Because you're also used to make proposals and participate in competitions, I suppose. So what's the main obstacle for quality and for measuring quality?
If you ask me about competitions, I would say there are several obstacles. One obstacle might be lack of openness, restrictive access, especially for young offices, for young colleagues, and sometimes not so well prepared competition briefs, and also sometimes jury decisions which are questionable. This happens. It doesn't happen very often, but it does. But still, I think it's And I'm mostly talking now about the public field. I think that architectural design competitions are the best way to procure buildings or the planning of buildings, because it's a quality-based and project-orientated procedure. Quality-based means the question is how to find the best project, the best quality in the project. And project-orientated means it's not the quality of a team, it's not the quality found out by examples in looking to the past, but it's the future project which is to come, and this is then the basis for the decision. So in my view, it's still one of the best, or perhaps the best way to procure, if it's open enough for all possible participants.
There, I see questions on the screen. Is quality in Baukultur a political or a technical discussion? Keep that. That's one of the. Keep that in mind. That can be a nice one to almost end our discussion. But then, Georg, architects are seldom involved in post-occupancy evaluation. Seemingly, this is where we'd be able to evaluate. How can we change that? Do you have any ideas about that? Do you go back, or do you go back to things that you have built or worked on a few years later? Does that happen?
I think you would hope to. I think larger. It seems like if you have a good relationship with the developer, I know there's another developer question, that they want to learn. They want to learn how their spaces are being used, how valuable their spaces are, so then they can make their next investment decisions. So I think that usually works. That can work if you have a good relationship with a developer in which you're kind of taking data that's gathered from the space. And maybe if you're lucky, and if you have, and this is where I said before, sometimes the developer is different from the tenant. But if you can start combining that with, let's say, job satisfaction data from let's say the occupant of the space, match that with maybe retention of people in their jobs, environmental data, all of these things. That's a pretty rich, interesting kind. These are not data. This is now insights into how people are using that space. So that might make you invest a little bit more money in one location over another. But that seems to often work if you have a longer relationship with the developer, because usually it seems everyone's getting kind of view of price. It's a price thing, and they get pushed out from. So I guess it's maybe making a case to them, and I'm going to try to answer that first question. I think they are incredibly important, and they hold the economic keys. But if you start to show them evidence and case studies of other projects that, when they learn in some ways from occupancy data, or when you run a program a certain way, community engagement, maybe some ideas around public realm improvement, that helps that, and show a developer that actually helps them get their project done faster. So I think this is the thing I think gets it. So if you're trying to fill up a building, you need that thing built, and nothing like an angry local public that's confused about what you're doing is going to slow that down. So if the numbers work out that you doing 50,000 pounds worth of community engagement, 50,000 pounds of VR visioning saves them 20 million pounds in idle, unused space, I think you can kind of get those little experiments funded.
Again, money and time. Is there a developer in the room? Yes. Can you take a mic,
Sure.
or come?
Would you like to fund some research?
There, the mic is there behind you. Yeah.
I'm not a developer anymore, but I've been working for developers 15 years. So that's how I sort of can say that I have a little bit of experience from the field, from that side. And what I would like to sort of connect to is that, if you can save a developer, especially time and in the process, and and if you can convince the developer that quality is necessary to shorten this time process, whatever quality, if it's build quality or process quality, you will find an easier recipient who is actually willing to talk about perhaps even cutting out some apartments for some better architectural spaces, because on the break even, the project is realized more quicker. So it's more that what I find is that there's often an idea at designers and architects that developers are just looking for the most cheapest way to realize a building and skip the quality, but this is actually not true. It's just they don't speak the language of architecture and design. So you need to sort of pick them up there and show that to them. And then,
So if I understand you well, we cannot, we have to change our vocabulary. We cannot speak about research anymore. We cannot use that term. We need to invent another word. And we should also not speak about quality, but speak about something else.
No, I think you should speak about quality and economy. Connect them together. I mean, the developers are not stupid, so it's so connect those things together. Be able to talk about the cash flow as well as you can talk about the quality of a certain spatial setup. Yeah. It's difficult. I mean, not every architect has this vocabulary, and you certainly can say, well, if the architect is expected to have this vocabulary, why the developer doesn't have my architectural vocabulary? But well, this is the client designer relation.
Yeah, please.
I say it very simply. I wouldn't waste my time to convince developers. I rather spend my time to convince local authorities, cities, etc., to take care that the development of the city goes in good rules. And there are many examples. I'm coming from Innsbruck, and we have since 10 years or even more, a kind of a basic rule. There's quite a strict regulatory plan, and if an investor comes and wants to build a bigger volume, he has to have a quality process. He has to make a competition or something else, and then he has also to provide some percentage of the apartments for a reasonable price. So it creates two things. It creates reasonable and affordable housing. At the same time, it creates a mix, which is also healthy for a city. So I believe in this kind of tools, and the same happens also in Vienna, where there is a kind of contractual planning agreements together with the investor and the city and the architect. So I think these are the things which really convince developers at the end.
Yeah. Well, it's the third party at the table is the public or the public authority in a way, and I think their main role is to facilitate the discussion and through rules and regulation maybe, but also just I'm from the Netherlands, and there I worked on several price competitions as developers with architects, but this was facilitated through a price competition, semi-open, semi-closed, and where the role of the government, of the authority, was to put these arguments on the table and to make time for this discussion and regulate that. That I think is also from my experience that if you want, because I'm trained as an architect, worked as a developer, and now back into architecture, is that you really need this third party to sort of block the economic because money and time, they always look for the quickest way, and as a public authority you can set. Sometimes you can block the road a little bit, or you say you have to go this diversion, and then and there the discussion on Baukultur is, I think.
There was a question, but I don't see it on the screen, about governance. Oh, sorry.
No, just one more sentence, because it's not so that the city is then working against developers. It's also so that developers, they have a learning process, and they find out that better quality of what they build is easier selling. So that's it's an education process on all sides.
And then we are back to the issue of governance. I don't know where it was, but isn't it often that there are misunderstandings? With Mrs. Professor Younes said this morning also, because people have different expectations from a developer, from the architects, from the engineers, from...
About expectations, I want to say another sentence from my place, from Innsbruck. We have undergone quite a strong, let's say, design development in the city in the last 25 years. It started in the late 90s. And one funny phenomenon for me is that in the early 90s it was quite normal that every restaurant or bar or whatever has been opened was in a kind of a kitschy style. And this is not happening anymore. It's quite normal that everybody who opens, it doesn't need to be great architecture or great design, but it's just normal, ordentlicher Standard, so quiet and not building any Almhütte, whatever. It's an actual standard of design which is done, and people are accepting this. They are not searching anymore this kitschy stuff. So there has been also education process in the public user audience in a way. So I'm quite optimistic. If there is good examples, if there's a good practice, it changes also the expectation of the people generally.
Paul, what do you think about the question on the screen? Is there a connection and influence between quality, value, and governance?
It's a tough question. Of course, I think quality is tough. And there was another question on the screen before about our differences between maybe what we think by quality. And it depends on the project. If it's a private sector client versus a public sector client, that can change quite a bit. Like, I think quality is, can we create affordable places in cities for people to come and live in, for someone to raise a family, to maybe start a business? And maybe that can only come by making a space that it only has a temporary use. We're seeing more and more of that in the UK, of just temporary use, temporary spaces, because material structure, and it's just for basic temporary housing. Would it be on the level of traditional Bauhaus aesthetic? No, but it's housing homeless or near homeless populations. So I think that question of quality is a really interesting debate. You're seeing in other areas, and that then ties into possibly that's the value, and then that is the governance. If the government's initiatives are to help all people, and if you're thinking about like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is the base level is are they housed and fed and cared for? Is that just again, not saying again quality is a baby step, as opposed to trying to strive for perfection and delay helping solve a situation. Again, it changes from private or public sector. There is definitely a connection between all of those. I completely agree with you about the three forces. The developer wants to save money, the government wants to save people, the designer's trying to deal with 10 projects at a time. But there is definitely, they play off of each other. And then the other comment I would make is around, as someone that comes from tech, it's nice to see that we're kind of moving beyond this smart city and smart spaces rhetoric, and it's this idea of like, we know technology will help us, but it's not. We know it's the answer, but we don't know if it's asking the right question, as that Cedric Price line was. But I think we're starting to like, smart cities aren't really technology cities anymore. They're just better. And so now I think we're talking about like, what is a better city or a space for us to be in? And I think that's interesting. It's not just a top-down tech, like kind of a tech monopoly companies trying to kind of dictate these terms.
Colin, is there a role for local authorities who more and more have responsibility for planning of our daily life environment? Is there a role for them in terms of governance for measuring quality? Or are they, because they're interested in being re-elected, and quality is a long-term aspiration, I would say. But do they still have a role? Do you think?
Are you suggesting that because of the motivation to be re-elected, there could be bias in
I don't know, I'm just asking a question.
I'm trying to see what's behind the curtain. I think that there has to be a role for local governments to be involved in testing. And I'm really only familiar with the North American context, but I know from there that, for example, in my city, I know that the urban design people in my own hometown are very much involved in testing, and they seek out partnerships with academics for exactly that reason. And I think that only makes sense. I mean, they have to have the metrics to know whether the things that they're doing, they're approving, not approving, make sense with respect to what's happening in their city. So yeah, fundamentally, they have to. If the question is more about whether, you know, there are ways to cook the books to make it look as though what they're doing is working, I'm sure that's always a possibility, but I try not to be cynical.
Well, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think you're starting to see other metrics like LEED scores for environmental design is coming in, and they're starting to measure more experience of space. I feel transportation has always been really great at this. You know, if you're writing on SBB, it's like beautiful service design. You can kind of tune and focus on every moment of basically wayfinding or kind of the service of it. So I think cities are starting to apply that in an interesting way. From a kind of a quality data, you do see there are these carbon zero goals that are in place. I think kind of disruption to a community is another really interesting one of saying if they're doing something with that lot, what could it be? We're working on a lot more of these meanwhile use spaces, which are really fascinating, where you're taking a lot that would have been kind of leveled for 2 years and empty and turning into maybe like a pop-up library or a food truck mart or something like that, where it actually, you know, in the meantime, it's kind of fostering this sense of a community. We worked on a project in London called Skip Garden, which was part of our project with King's Cross and Coal Drop Yards. Massive, you know, multi-year project, but it was this kind of cool community garden that actually the issue now that they're running into is now the developer actually was like, hey, we gave you that land for 10 years and now we kind of need it to do something with it. You're actually seeing a pretty hostile activist community that only came together because the developer gave them the land to build the garden on. But I think you see a lot of and that kind of veered a bit, but you see a lot of these interesting uses of spaces that can actually be quantified in a way. Environmental, you know, maybe are we measuring the wrong things? Are you fostering a sense of community? I think that was really my point. And I think that's exciting. So I think that's hopefully how we're being judged on. We were talking about a little bit earlier about a lot of mayors in China. Mayors in China have really strict goals. It's how much economic development are you bringing into your community? How much are you leveling up people from you know, economic levels to the middle class? You know, look, I know we can go both sides, and that's maybe a different conference. But then other things is, are they achieving carbon net zero goals? I haven't seen any of my clients in the West kind of have that. And if that mayor doesn't do it, they're not waiting for a vote. They're gone. They're replaced that next day. So it's really interesting that they have really clear standards in which they're starting to build for. You know, some are obviously pretty opaque, and there's different drivers, but.
Because you said, what should we do out there? I would say just clean up the cars and some green, and that's it. I think we should much more often just undo, not build, do nothing. This is of course not very nice to my community, but I would say it would be a good goal. And adding to my 3 meters, the 3 meters rule is no apartment lower than 3 meters. It's a crime to put people in these low 25, 250 centimeter boxes. And the second rule I would like to have is no cars in the cities. We should have a very radical, and I'm sorry, I wouldn't need testing for that. We should just do it simply. No cars in cities. We should clean up the crime which has been happening in the last second half of the last century. It's the habit to have everywhere a car on the street. It's crazy, all the way.
Well, maybe we should have that in mind during our coffee break, about the idea of cleaning up the crimes of the previous crimes. I think we took quite a lot of things away. We did not save all the. We did not solve all the problems, but there was quite a lot of link with what was said this morning. I would like to, before we close these sessions, say that it was not possible to answer all the questions, unfortunately, but many of them were linked, and I hope that we find a way to make them available. I have some announcements to make, practical announcements to make for you. For those who are on the tours tomorrow, you received a sheet like this. Very important, if you don't have it, you take it up at one of the tables, because it indicates the meeting points, and you have to be there at the time, at the place and time mentioned sharp. The second thing is about the parallel sessions. There are two. One is on streetscapes, session number 1, and this will be after the coffee break in this room. The second parallel session is on workscapes, and that will be upstairs in the Petit Dôme. The names of the rooms are important, because if you use Slido, you have to select Grand Dôme here, or Petit Dôme if you're upstairs. The other very important thing is, if you go to Petit Dôme upstairs, only use the staircase that is indicated. If you don't, you arrive in the middle of the room, and that can be a little bit of an embarrassment. So we didn't want you to do. Just before we break, the last question that I promised is: quality in Baukultur a political or technical discussion? One word.
Quite clear political discussion.
Paul?
I would agree with that.
You can have a different opinion.
I do have a different opinion. No, slightly different.
But you only, we are supposed to finish, so you don't have 5 minutes.
I'm a New Yorker who just drank a lot of coffee before I could. Yes.
Yes.
I'm going to be wishy-washy and say both. Primarily political, but it has to be informed by a technical discussion.
Excellent conclusion. I invite you now for the coffee. Thank you.